The Innocent Guilty, Chicago, summer 1921. Amelia could still hear the rhythm of her mother's voice as she washed the clothes. White sheets, clean sheets, till everything's right. She murmured the words like a lullaby as she scrubbed, her hands aching from the cold well water and harsh lye soap. But that same voice that spoke in soft rhythms at home became harder in the halls of the court. Her mother was not here now. No family member was, not since they told Amelia that her family wasn't allowed inside. Her crime was simple, walking back from the rail yard with her cousin at dusk. Yet, under the dim lights of the courthouse, she and her cousin Marcus faced a judge who peered at them over thin spectacles. Not so much a person as an authority wrapped in shadow. There was no plea offered, only a story written over their heads and etched into every glance they received in that hall. Black children walking home at dusk must be up to something. For young girls like Amelia, growing up in the shadows of a society that didn't see her as innocent or worthy of protection, childhood wasn't the realm of innocence, but rather of constant suspicion. She was only 13, but her mother always said that in the city, her age didn't matter much. From what Amelia could see, her mother was right. Before entering the story, please subscribe to help TMI Stories reach 1,000 subscribers. The court's iron gates. A few blocks away, 15-year-old James sat on the curb outside the Illinois Training School for Boys. Just like Amelia, he'd been swept into the justice system not long ago after being accused of stealing from a local shop, a shop whose owner had seen him at the corner but could not say what he'd taken. James had been held for questioning for over 3 days, without anyone to explain what that meant. Here, he learned quickly to keep his head down, not ask questions, and avoid the men with keys and badges. The training school was like another world, locked, cold, and wholly indifferent to who he had been before this moment. James had grown up taking his little brother to church on Sunday mornings and walking his sister to school. He wasn't a thief, he was a brother, a son, and an ordinary kid. Yet his very presence on the street, at the wrong hour or in the wrong neighborhood, was enough to brand him guilty. As he sat there, he saw another group of boys in identical gray uniforms. They looked back at him with hollow eyes, carrying on their shoulders the unspoken knowledge that they had left their childhoods behind the moment they entered the system. Constructing criminality. For Chicago's black youth, innocence was a tenuous thing, something that white children were afforded without question, but that black children had to defend and prove constantly. The courts were not designed to treat them as children in need of reform, but as almost adults in need of punishment. The legal system seemed set up to see each black boy and girl as already guilty, as if juvenile delinquent was a phrase waiting to be stamped on their futures. State witness, come forward. The voice echoed, jolting Amelia back into the present. She looked to the left and saw Marcus, her cousin, shifting nervously in his oversized jacket. He was only 2 years older than she was, but his shoulders slumped under the weight of accusations he barely understood. She thought about the way he'd shielded her on the walk home, stepping between her and every street corner as they made their way from the rail yard. But even that gesture of protection had been turned against him. The prosecutor twisted it into something darker, that he had moved suspiciously and covered his companion. The court made no attempt to acknowledge their age. They were 13 and 15, but those numbers meant nothing here. There was no recognition of innocence, no understanding that they had simply been two cousins walking home. The other side of childhood, across town, Mrs. Winifred Sanderson organized a group of concerned mothers, advocating for the protection of children's innocence at the Cook County Juvenile Court. Her pamphlets, printed on creamy cardstock, spoke of the sacred duty to protect our youth. Yet these mothers did not advocate for black children, and Amelia's mother wasn't invited to the meetings. The concerns of Mrs. Sanderson and her peers seemed to exclude children like Amelia and Marcus altogether. The judge's gavel cracked against the wooden podium. Amelia knew what would happen next. She would go to the Illinois Training School for Girls, the place her mother had warned her about. It was a place where girls like her, a child of color as the social workers put it, were taught the meaning of delinquency and discipline. She had heard the stories of the Geneva Training School, hours of chores, nights spent in silence, and the constant sense of being watched. The teachers there didn't try to understand the girls. They saw them as wayward, in need of correction. As the courtroom emptied, Amelia felt the weight of her new reality settling on her shoulders. She wasn't sure what she had done wrong, but one thing became clear. Here, in this court, Her childhood innocence had been surrendered, not by her actions, but by the color of her skin and the place she called home. The walls within Chicago, autumn 1921, Amelia pulled her thin woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders as she waited for her mother to leave. They were allowed one visit a month at the Geneva training school, and Amelia had learned to cherish these stolen moments. Her mother's visits were a lifeline, a thread to a world she was beginning to forget, a world of crowded church services, bustling street vendors, and family suppers at their kitchen table. Her mother spoke softly as she handed Amelia a carefully wrapped loaf of bread and an apple from the last of the season's harvest. "Keep your head down," she whispered, eyes glancing nervously at the matron who hovered near the door. "This place, it's not a place for you, child. You keep your head down, you hear?" Amelia nodded, her voice too thick with emotion to respond. She wanted to ask her mother when she could come home, to hear her say, "soon." But her mother only hugged her tight, leaving that question, and the many others Amelia held in her heart, unanswered. She watched her mother disappear down the cold hallway, and when she turned back, the matron's eyes were already on her. Rules and rebellion, life at Geneva Training School was tightly controlled, down to the smallest detail. Days began with bells and ended with bells, the hours between dictated by routines that no one dared disrupt. Each morning, the girls marched in silence to the washroom, performed their assigned chores, and spent long hours in lessons about propriety and respectability. The school's staff emphasized that they were here to be reformed, to be made proper. But Amelia saw no reform. Instead, she saw suppression. Every lesson taught her to be quiet, to hide her emotions, to blend into the shadows. But even as she kept her head down, Amelia found herself questioning, especially at night, when the lights were dimmed and the murmured voices of the other girls filled the dormitory. In the quiet, they shared whispered stories of their old neighborhoods, their families, and their lives before Geneva. Many, like Amelia, hadn't committed any real crime, only misdemeanors born of poverty and bad timing. She had met girls accused of wandering, vagrancy, or simply disorderly behavior. The reasons seemed as arbitrary as the punishments. Amelia's closest friend at Geneva was a girl named Lottie, a slender girl with piercing brown eyes and a sharp tongue. Lottie had been sent here on account of her incorrigible behavior, or so the court had labeled it. Her real crime, as far as Amelia could tell, was having a defiant spirit. Lottie wasn't one to bend easily, and Amelia admired her for it. One evening, as they sat folding sheets in the laundry, Lottie whispered to her, "They want us to be invisible, you know? Want us to believe we're not worth seeing." She shot Amelia a sideways glance. "But I see you, and I see me, and I don't see nothing wrong with us." Amelia nodded, feeling the swell of something almost like hope. It was dangerous, she knew, to let herself believe in freedom. But Lottie's words planted a seed in her, a small reminder of the world outside these walls. The men's ward, across town, in the training school for boys at St. Charles, Marcus's life mirrored Amelia's in many ways, but it bore its own unique burdens. Life at St. Charles was harsher, the discipline strict and unyielding. Marcus had long ago learned the truth. Boys like him weren't meant to be fixed. They were meant to be broken. The guards saw any sign of rebellion as a threat, and they had a particular disdain for boys like Marcus, black boys who resisted quietly or subtly challenged authority. Marcus's survival hinged on maintaining a delicate balance. He learned to keep his head down, to work without complaint, and to answer with "yes, sir," and "no, sir." The other boys were wary of speaking openly, each choosing silence over confrontation. But in the quiet hours, Marcus found solace in small, secret acts of defiance. He drew pictures in the dirt by the garden wall, hiding them before morning light, small reminders of the world he used to know and the dreams he held on to. The other boys treated him with respect, sensing that he carried himself differently. His family had prepared him for this place in a way, with his father's lectures about pride and his mother's nightly prayers for strength. Those teachings echoed in his mind each day, reminding him of who he was, even as the school tried to strip him of his identity. Secrets and solidarity. Amelia and Marcus both found companionship and solidarity within the confines of their respective institutions, though in different forms. At Geneva, Amelia discovered that the friendship she formed with girls like Lottie gave her a sense of strength. The girls would meet in corners during chores, exchanging jokes and sharing whispered stories of their families, carefully preserving the warmth of the outside world. In the boys' school, Marcus found a similar camaraderie in the shared silences, in the way he and the others would glance at one another as they marched to breakfast or exchanged knowing looks across the yard. They didn't need words. A glance was often enough to communicate the mix of anger, fear, and resilience that burned in each of them. The system saw these children as criminals in training, young bodies that could be molded into compliance or crushed under the weight of authority. But for Amelia and Marcus, survival was a quiet, daily revolution, a choice to hold on to who they were, even as the world around them tried to erase their humanity. The punitive path. The matron noticed Amelia's increasing confidence, noting her whispered conversations with Lottie and the occasional defiant glance in her direction. One morning, after Amelia had let out a small, involuntary laugh during breakfast, the matron pulled her aside. "Laughing, are we? Do you think this is a place for laughter?" The matron sneered. "You girls think too highly of yourselves, laughing and carrying on like that." Amelia's cheeks burned and she cast her eyes downward, afraid of what she might say if she looked directly into the matron's eyes. But inside, she held tight to Lottie's words. "They want us to be invisible, but I see you and I see me." She took a quiet, steady breath, telling herself she would not be erased, not here, not anywhere. When she returned to the table, Lottie gave her a subtle nod of solidarity, and Amelia knew she wasn't alone. The silent protests. Winter 1921, Geneva Training School for Girls. Amelia pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. Winter had seeped into every corner of the Geneva Training School, settling over the building like a cold weight that refused to leave. Snow was beginning to cover the streets outside, and though she couldn't see it from her dormitory window, she could feel it in the air, a bitter chill that crept through the walls and into her bones. The cold seemed to amplify the silence. Each day grew more monotonous, the rigid schedule more oppressive. At times, Amelia felt like the days were an endless cycle of chores and silence, of keeping her head down and trying to stay invisible. But a part of her, a small but persistent spark, was beginning to resist that invisibility. The first act. One morning, the matron assigned Amelia and Lottie to scrub the floors of the administration hall, a duty usually reserved for the older girls. Lottie leaned close as they worked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't by chance, you know. They think we're getting too comfortable. But I say, we make this floor our own." Amelia didn't fully understand what Lottie meant until they began to scrub. Lottie made an effort to leave a faint outline in her scrubbing, marking small shapes that would go unnoticed at a distance but could be seen up close. Hearts, stars, and lines filled the floor in patterns, a quiet act of rebellion that filled Amelia with an unfamiliar sense of control. As she scrubbed, she felt as though they were reclaiming a piece of themselves within the strict confines of the institution. Later, when they had finished and the matron returned, Amelia noticed her watching them with a new wariness. Amelia had never dared meet her gaze directly, but that day she raised her eyes. For a brief moment she held the matron's gaze before glancing down again, her heart pounding in her chest. The matron scowled but said nothing. As the girls filed back to the dormitory that evening, they shared small, knowing smiles. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny protest in a world that demanded their silence. Marcus's new mentor, over at St. Charles, Marcus had been assigned a new task: assisting Mr. Harper, an older groundskeeper who had worked at the school for as long as anyone could remember. Mr. Harper was one of the few adults who spoke to the boys as if they were real people. He was gruff, but not unkind, and he often talked to Marcus in a low voice as they worked. "Keep your head up, boy," Mr. Harper said one day as they were hauling sacks of feed for the livestock. "They want to see you broken. You don't give them the satisfaction, you hear?" Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond. Mr. Harper was the first adult to acknowledge the reality of the boy's situation, even if only in veiled words. His encouragement became a kind of armor that Marcus wore silently, a shield against the daily grind of the institution's harsh discipline. Mr. Harper didn't sugarcoat anything, but he offered Marcus something rare, a glimpse of dignity within the brutal world of St. Charles. One afternoon, as they were working by the fence near the main road, Marcus caught sight of a group of men walking by in dark coats, their breath visible in the cold air. They were not school officials or city officers, but black men in worn clothes, speaking in low tones. Marcus watched them pass, and a new thought bloomed in his mind. A connection to a world outside these walls, to people who might understand what he was going through. He didn't know these men, but the sight of them brought him a strange, fierce hope. The protest begins. As the weeks wore on, both Amelia and Marcus found their silent protests growing in strength and subtlety. The symbols Amelia and Lottie left in the floors became more intricate, their presence barely noticeable but deeply significant to the girls. Each heart or line was a declaration, a reminder that they were still there, resisting the system that sought to erase them. At St. Charles, Marcus's defiance took a different form. He began memorizing every route, every door, every pattern in the guards' movements. He shared his knowledge with the other boys, teaching them how to avoid the places where discipline was strictest and how to find brief moments of peace amid the harsh routines. One evening after lights out, he whispered to a boy in the next cot over, a quiet plan forming in his mind. "We may not get out of here anytime soon," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, "but we don't have to let them take everything from us." The boy nodded, understanding immediately. Together, they began planning small disruptions, ways to push back without getting caught. It was a slow, painstaking process, but it gave them a sense of purpose. It was a way to resist, even if the world outside could not see them. The visit, back at Geneva, Amelia waited anxiously for the next monthly visit from her mother. She had counted the days, drawing tallies in the dirt beside her cot, a private calendar that gave her something to look forward to. Her mother arrived looking thinner, her face lined with worry, but she embraced Amelia with fierce warmth. For a brief, precious moment, they were alone in the small visiting room, and Amelia clutched her mother's hands. "Mama, do you think they'll ever let me come home?" she whispered, the question she had been holding on to for months, slipping out before she could stop herself. Her mother looked at her with a sadness that was almost too heavy to bear. "I'm fighting, Amelia. I'm fighting with everything I've got. They say it'll take time, but don't you give up. You hold on, you hear?" Amelia nodded, swallowing back the ache in her throat. The words lingered in her mind, a thin thread of hope that she held on to as her mother left, her footsteps echoing down the hall. That night, as she lay in her cot, Amelia clutched that hope to her chest. She thought of the shapes she and Lottie had left on the floors, of Marcus at St. Charles and his secret maps, of her mother's quiet strength. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of something she had almost forgotten, a sense of power, small and quiet, but hers nonetheless. Quiet resolve. As winter settled over Chicago, Amelia and Marcus's protests continued to grow, invisible to the guards but undeniable to those who participated. At Geneva, Amelia and the other girls began leaving small tokens, a piece of thread, a single feather, a broken button, hidden in the corners of the laundry room. Each token held a meaning, a small piece of the world they had been forced to leave behind. At St. Charles, Marcus and the boys refined their plans, learning to time their routines to avoid the harshest punishments. Each small act of defiance built a camaraderie among them, a shared understanding that, even here, they could hold on to their dignity. The institutions may have tried to break them, but Amelia, Marcus, and the others discovered a strength they hadn't known they possessed. It was a strength that came from knowing who they were, from seeing themselves in each other, even when the world refused to do the same. A tenuous brotherhood, St. Charles Boys Training School. As the harsh Chicago winter deepened, Marcus adjusted to life under even stricter rules at St. Charles. The guards kept a closer watch on him and the other boys they suspected of conspiring. For boys like Marcus, resistance had always been quiet, almost invisible, manifesting in the smallest gestures that could easily pass as accidental. But as the weeks passed, Marcus found himself longing for something more. A deeper, more connected kind of rebellion that would make a statement no one could ignore. Marcus found a mentor in Mr. Harper, the older groundskeeper whose quiet wisdom had sustained generations of boys who'd passed through the doors of St. Charles. Harper was a small, wiry man with graying hair and calloused hands. He spoke in a low voice, telling Marcus about his own struggles growing up in a world that seemed to assign black men the hardest paths. Harper didn't offer sympathy, but he did share stories of endurance and resilience, passing down lessons like a father might. Lessons shaped by hardship and survival. Lessons in resistance. Mr. Harper's guidance was more subtle than Marcus had expected. He taught him things like how to move unseen through the grounds at night, or how to recognize which guards were paying attention and which were more easily distracted. Harper even shared his own secret, a small alcove he had built years ago in a forgotten corner of the grounds where he sometimes went to escape. "I know you're wondering why I stay," Harper said one cold afternoon as they worked in silence near the supply shed. "But I stay to watch over you boys. Someone has to be here, to remember that you're people, even if no one else seems to." Harper's words sank deep into Marcus's mind. They brought a new understanding to his situation, that his resistance wasn't just about fighting for himself, but for all the boys who might come after him. For Marcus, this revelation gave him a new strength. He began to pay closer attention to his surroundings, memorizing the patterns of the guards and the layout of the grounds. The knowledge was a kind of quiet power, a feeling of control within a place that sought to strip him of it. A plan in the making. One evening, as the boys filed into the dining hall, Marcus exchanged a glance with a younger boy named Terence, whose wide, frightened eyes had reminded him of himself when he first arrived. Terence looked up to Marcus, following him around when he could, and mimicking his quiet resolve. For Marcus, the younger boy's admiration was a heavy responsibility, one that compelled him to find ways to shield Terence from the worst of the school's punishments. As the meal progressed, Marcus quietly shared Harper's teachings with the few boys seated closest to him. They leaned in, pretending to look at their food, absorbing Marcus's words. He shared the small tricks Harper had taught him, the shifts in the guards' patterns, the places where they could safely gather without being seen, and the hidden alcove that Harper had shown him. Together they began to form a fragile network, a brotherhood, bound not by blood, but by shared suffering and the need to protect one another. Their plan was simple: to find ways to avoid unnecessary punishments, to help one another by sharing information, and to protect the youngest and most vulnerable boys among them. They couldn't break free, but they could lessen the harm inflicted on each other. And in doing so, they could hold on to a piece of themselves, preserving their dignity even as the system tried to erode it. A silent march. One cold morning, Marcus and a few other boys took their resistance a step further. They decided to stage a silent march, a walk across the yard during a time when they were supposed to be cleaning. Without saying a word, they rose from their tasks, lined up, and walked in a steady line from one end of the yard to the other. The guards were immediately suspicious, barking orders for them to return to their posts. But the boys kept marching, their faces expressionless, their feet crunching in the thin layer of frost that covered the ground. The march was short-lived. The guards forced them to stop and threatened them with isolation if they continued to defy orders. But the effect lingered. For a few brief moments, they had claimed space as their own, moving in unity, their silent act of defiance like a protest song that no one else could hear. The march was a small victory, but it rippled through the school, giving strength to those who had long felt invisible. It was proof that even here, they could choose how to carry themselves. They couldn't change their circumstances, but they could change the way they responded to them, finding power in solidarity. Mr. Harper's warning. That evening, Harper pulled Marcus aside as they swept the grounds in the fading daylight. "Careful, boy," he warned. "They're watching you closer now. They know you're getting these boys riled up, and they won't stand for it." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of Harper's words. But he also felt a surge of defiance. He was tired of hiding, tired of shrinking himself to avoid punishment. He knew the risks, but he was ready to take them, to show the others that they didn't have to be afraid. The next day, he noticed more boys standing a little straighter, walking with a touch more pride. They exchanged nods, small gestures that said, "I see you, and I'm with you." For Marcus, it was enough to know he wasn't alone. Hope in small places, Geneva training school for girls, spring arrived slowly at Geneva, and with it came small, subtle changes. Amelia noticed buds pushing through the frozen ground, birds returning to the barren trees outside the dormitory window. The natural world seemed to be reclaiming itself, inch by inch, and Amelia felt her spirit stir in response. She clung to the season's promise of renewal, finding solace in every small sign of life. For Amelia and the other girls, the passing months had hardened them, but the shared defiance that blossomed in winter had also drawn them closer. Each act of quiet rebellion, the shapes they left in the laundry room, the whispered conversations in the dormitory at night, strengthened their bond and gave them a sense of control in a world that otherwise denied them any. A new arrival? In early March, a new girl arrived at Geneva. Her name was Sarah, and the bruises on her arms and the vacant look in her eyes told the other girls everything they needed to know. She had been treated harshly, perhaps even more harshly than they had been, and was unaccustomed to the routines of silence and obedience that governed life at the school. Sarah's presence reminded the girls of their first days at Geneva. The terror, the confusion, and the struggle to adapt to a world that neither protected nor understood them. Amelia felt an instant connection to Sarah. She saw in her a reflection of her younger self, the frightened girl who had walked into the court that first day, unsure of what she had done wrong. Determined to protect her, Amelia introduced Sarah to Lottie, and together they showed her how to navigate the school's strict routines without drawing unnecessary attention. They shared the tricks they'd learned to avoid punishment, the hidden corners where the girls could speak freely, and the rituals they had created to sustain one another. Building a circle, Lottie, ever bold, proposed something new, a silent gathering after Sunday chapel. It was risky, but Lottie believed that a visible, silent protest could remind them all that they were not alone, that their sisterhood was stronger than the institution's rules. Amelia agreed, though she knew the danger. The matron was already watching them closely, her suspicions growing with each passing day. That Sunday, as the chapel service ended, Amelia, Lottie, Sarah, and a few other girls lingered in the yard, arranging themselves in a circle. They stood with heads bowed, hands clasped in front of them, their bodies close but silent. It was a quiet act, easily dismissed by the guards as a moment of prayer, but it held a deeper significance for the girls. For those few minutes, they were no longer alone. The circle became a shield, a space where they could exist beyond the confines of the school's rules. In the silence, they each felt a spark of hope, a reminder that their identities couldn't be erased, that they were more than the labels and punishments assigned to them. Consequences and unity. When the matron noticed the girls standing together in the yard, her face tightened, and she approached them, her voice sharp and cold. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her eyes scanning each of their faces as if looking for a sign of defiance. None of the girls answered, each one keeping her gaze steady. The matron threatened them with isolation if they continued congregating. But to Amelia's surprise, Lottie raised her head, meeting the matron's gaze directly, her expression fierce and unyielding. The matron's threat hung in the air, but the girls did not disperse until she turned and walked away, leaving them to their silent protest. After that day, the girls continued their Sunday ritual, gathering in the yard after chapel each week. The circle grew as more girls joined, drawn by the sense of solidarity that emanated from the group. It was an unspoken promise, a vow that they would support one another through whatever came next. The seeds of change. Over time, the silent gatherings became a staple of their lives at Geneva, giving the girls a sense of purpose and belonging. Even as punishments grew harsher and the matron's vigilance intensified, the circle persisted. The more the school tried to break their spirits, the more determined the girls became to protect their quiet sanctuary. For Amelia, these gatherings were a reminder of her family, of her mother's warmth and her father's strength. She held on to these memories as tightly as she held on to her friends, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was not truly alone. Through their shared defiance, the girls began to shape their own identities, reclaiming pieces of themselves that the system had tried to strip away. The weekly ritual inspired hope in Amelia, hope that one day she would walk free from Geneva, stronger and more certain of who she was. And even if she couldn't leave, she knew that she had found something powerful in the sisterhood she had helped build. A family forged not by blood, but by resilience and quiet rebellion. The spring of freedom, both schools early 1922. The snow melted in early March, revealing patches of muddy ground around the Geneva and St. Charles training schools. For Amelia and Marcus, spring brought both hope and a sense of urgency. They had spent months resisting in silence, their spirits sustained by small acts of rebellion and the bonds they'd forged with those around them. But as spring arrived, so did new challenges, with the schools tightening their grip in response to the children's growing unity. Amelia continued to lead the Sunday circles at Geneva, the group now larger than ever. Each week, more girls joined, finding solace and strength in the quiet solidarity of the ritual. Lottie, who had become Amelia's closest confidant, spoke openly in the dormitory at night, rallying the others with whispered encouragements. "They may have us locked up here," she'd say, her voice fierce yet soft, "but they don't own us. We're our own people, and no one can take that." Across town, at St. Charles, Marcus's small network of boys continued their subtle forms of defiance, each act binding them closer together. Under Mr. Harper's watchful eye, Marcus took on a quiet leadership role, guiding the younger boys through routines with confidence. He became known among the boys as someone who could be trusted, someone who understood how to survive without surrendering entirely. But he knew that the guards were watching him, and that his influence was becoming harder to hide. The turning point. One crisp morning in April, as the boys marched to breakfast, Marcus and his friend Terence noticed a group of guards gathered by the administrative building, their voices low and tense. One of the older boys, overhearing part of their conversation, later relayed the message. The guards were planning to send some of the troublemakers to a harsher institution if the unrest didn't subside. Marcus knew he was likely among those considered troublesome, and he felt both fear and resolve welling up inside him. He had come too far to stop now, and he felt a responsibility to show the younger boys that they didn't have to live in fear. That night, he whispered his plan to Terence. A coordinated sit-down protest during morning roll call. It was a risky move, one that could mean harsher punishments, but he was willing to take the chance. Terence and a few other boys agreed, and the next morning, as the guards lined them up in the yard, they sat down in unison, folding their arms across their chests. It was a simple act, yet its meaning was unmistakable, a refusal to participate in the school's oppressive routine. The guards reacted swiftly, shouting and yanking the boys to their feet, but the protest had made its mark. For a brief moment, they had disrupted the order, asserting their dignity in a way that couldn't be ignored. Strength in numbers. Back at Geneva, Amelia and the other girls were also feeling the mounting pressure. The matron's patience had worn thin, and punishments were issued more frequently, especially for girls like Lottie, who were seen as leaders. But the Sunday gatherings continued, each one a statement of unity that the matron couldn't completely eradicate. One Sunday, as the girls gathered, they were joined by a new face. Sarah, the quiet girl with the bruises from her earlier arrival. She had watched from afar for weeks, too afraid to join, but this time she stepped into the circle, her head held high. Her presence was a powerful reminder that their resistance extended beyond any single girl. It was a shared legacy, one that gave each of them the courage to endure. The circle that day felt stronger than ever. As they stood in silence, Amelia felt a surge of pride and gratitude. The girls had become more than friends. They were family, bound together by their shared suffering and resilience. The matron could punish them, but she couldn't break the connection they had formed. The release, in May, after months of advocacy, Amelia's mother finally succeeded in drawing attention to her daughter's case. Local activists, spurred by the stories of mistreatment coming out of Chicago's juvenile institutions, began to demand reforms. The work of Amelia's mother, along with other community members, had caught the eye of influential allies who pressured the court to review Amelia's case. After a final, tense hearing, Amelia was released. The news spread quickly through Geneva, filling the other girls with a bittersweet mixture of joy and loss. Amelia hugged Lottie tightly before leaving, promising to carry their memory with her and to work for change on the outside. She knew that leaving would be difficult, that she would carry the scars of Geneva for years to come, but she was determined to honor the strength she had found there. Around the same time, Marcus received news of his own release, granted on the condition of community oversight. His mother's efforts, along with the advocacy of local activists, had finally paid off. Marcus felt a mix of relief and sadness as he said goodbye to Terence and the other boys. Like Amelia, he left with a renewed sense of purpose, vowing to continue resisting the forces that sought to control him. Reuniting and remembering. When Amelia and Marcus returned to their neighborhood, they found a world both familiar and irrevocably changed. They reunited with their families, yet they carried with them memories that set them apart. They met one day by the rail yard, where they had first been taken into custody. The place now seemed smaller, yet full of meaning, a reminder of the journey they had survived and the battles that lay ahead. As they walked, they shared stories of their time in the schools, their acts of resistance, and the friends they had left behind. Amelia spoke of the circle and the girls who had become her sisters, and Marcus described the sit-down protest and Mr. Harper's guidance. Their stories were bound by a shared understanding, an unspoken commitment to honor those who were still trapped within the system. They knew they would carry their experiences with them forever, and though the scars would remain, so would the strength they had forged in the face of injustice. Together, they resolved to keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for the children still caught in the grip of an unjust system. In the eyes of the city, Chicago, early summer 1922, the warm air swept through the streets of Chicago, a sharp contrast to the cold, restrictive walls of the juvenile institutions Amelia and Marcus had finally left behind. The city, with its bustling markets, wide streets, and endless noise, felt different to them now. Larger, filled with both possibilities and obstacles they hadn't fully understood before. But the city also felt like a new beginning, a place where they could use the resilience they had found in the quiet rebellion of their confinement. Though they had only been separated by a few miles in their respective institutions, their shared struggle had forged a unique bond. Amelia and Marcus met every few days, talking about their dreams, their scars, and the unshakable responsibility they felt toward the friends they had left behind. Together, they had endured a world that had tried to crush them. And now they stood on the outside, determined to give meaning to their suffering. The fight for reform. Amelia's mother, A soft-spoken woman who had once shied away from any form of public confrontation had found a voice she didn't know she had. Fueled by the injustices her daughter had endured, she joined forces with local activists, many of whom were parents and relatives of children who had suffered similar fates. They worked together, writing letters to the city's newspapers, organizing public forums, and holding community gatherings to draw attention to the abuse and neglect that too often defined Chicago's juvenile institutions. Amelia accompanied her mother to many of these meetings, standing in the back with her head high as her mother recounted the stories Amelia had told her. Stories of young girls punished for speaking, of matronly cruelty and stolen childhoods. Amelia's presence at these gatherings was a silent testimony to the damage these institutions inflicted, a reminder to the crowd that this was not just a distant issue, but a deeply personal one, affecting families within their very neighborhoods. Marcus, too, found himself drawn into the movement. He spoke at a local community meeting one evening, his voice steady yet fierce, as he recounted his time at St. Charles and the solidarity he had built with his fellow inmates. He described Mr. Harper's mentorship and the strength the boys had found in one another, using his story to illustrate the urgent need for change. His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement, and in that moment, Marcus felt his story transform from a private pain into a public call for justice. Seeking justice, the activists' persistence eventually drew the attention of local newspapers, and a reporter from the Chicago Defender approached Amelia and Marcus. Both felt hesitant, protective of their experiences, and wary of being reduced to symbols. But they understood the power of stories, of showing the world that they were not just names on a report, but real children with real lives. The article, published the following week, spoke of the criminalization of youth in Chicago, highlighting the stories of Amelia, Marcus, and others like them. The piece sparked outrage within the community, forcing city officials to confront the ugly realities of the juvenile justice system. Public outcry grew louder, with demands for oversight, better treatment, and alternatives to punitive institutions. In the weeks that followed, the city formed a commission to investigate allegations of abuse in juvenile facilities. Activists, lawyers, and former detainees testified before the commission, their voices united in a shared demand for reform. Amelia and Marcus stood side by side as they watched the hearings unfold, feeling for the first time a sense of power over the system that had tried to silence them. A community's strength. The movement for reform brought Amelia and Marcus closer to the people in their community, strengthening bonds they hadn't realized were there. Elders in their neighborhood shared their own stories of hardship, of navigating a world that had always been set against them. These stories, of discrimination, resilience, and quiet defiance, echoed the lessons they had learned in confinement. Their families also felt the ripple effects of their journey. Amelia's mother, once a reserved woman, became a leader within the movement, her voice carrying the weight of both personal experience and communal grief. Marcus's mother, too, found support in other parents who had fought similar battles, finding solace in the shared understanding of what it meant to fear for one's child in a system that did not value them. For Amelia and Marcus, this community solidarity became a source of healing, reminding them that their pain was not isolated, but woven into a larger story of struggle and survival. They understood now that their fight was part of a broader history, a history that included every mother who fought for her child, every father who struggled to protect his family, and every child who had to learn resilience far too young. A promise for the future. One evening, Amelia and Marcus returned to the rail yard, the place where their lives had first changed. They walked in silence, feeling the weight of both their pasts and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Yet for the first time, they felt free. Not free from the memories that marked them, but free from the fear that had once bound them. Standing by the tracks, they made a promise to one another, to continue the work their families and communities had begun. They vowed to help other children avoid the fate they had endured, to work toward a world where no child was seen as a criminal before being seen as a child. Their bond, strengthened by hardship and resilience, would fuel them as they moved forward, carrying with them the stories of those they had left behind. The lasting legacy. Amelia and Marcus's story is one of endurance, resilience, and transformation. They enter a system designed to erase their innocence and individuality, and though they emerge with scars, both visible and invisible, their struggles teach them about inner strength and the power of collective resistance. Their journey reveals that even within the most oppressive environments, small acts of defiance can sustain the human spirit and forge lasting bonds of solidarity. Through their friendships, shared acts of protest, and the wisdom passed down from others who faced similar battles, Amelia and Marcus discover that their worth lies not in the judgments imposed upon them, but in their own ability to see themselves and each other as whole, deserving individuals. Their journey is a testament to the strength found in community and the profound courage of those who refuse to be silenced. Their story reminds us of the need to address the structural injustices that continue to affect marginalized youth, illuminating the power of empathy, advocacy, and the courage it takes to believe in one's own worth against all odds. As they step forward into a world still rife with prejudice, they carry with them a quiet but unbreakable resolve, a legacy of strength that will shape their futures and, hopefully, inspire others to fight for a more just and compassionate world. Thank you for watching the story. If you find the video interesting and meaningful, please comment 0 and subscribe to the channel TMY Stories. We will bring many interesting and meaningful stories to our audience. Once again, thank you everyone for listening.